Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just looking at a city's history. We're essentially performing an autopsy. We're going to dissect the story of Detroit to figure out how one of America's greatest cities could just die. A slow, silent death, right while the world was watching.
Let's start with this idea right here, because it really gets to the heart of the mystery. You know, if a person collapses on the street, someone runs to help, right? It's immediate, it's visible. But a city? That's a whole different ballgame. Its collapse is slow, it's spread out over decades, and it happens right out in the open, often with nobody really rushing in to help until it's way, way too late.
So, to really get a handle on the fall, we have to look at the city when it was at the absolute height of its power. We need to see that vibrant, healthy body before the sickness took hold. It was a city built on this incredible dream.
You know, back then, Detroit wasn't just a place, it was a sound, an engine roaring to life. Think about it, the roar of steel presses, the blast of factory whistles, the rumble of brand new cars rolling off the line, and of course, the sound of Motown music. That was the soundtrack to the 20th century. This was the noise of prosperity, the sound of the American dream literally being manufactured and shipped out to the world.
So here we have what's called the Detroit formula. And honestly, it seemed foolproof at the time. You have mass production, you have high-paying union jobs, and that creates this massive, thriving middle class. And the beautiful part? They could afford to buy the very cars they were building. It was this perfect, self-sustaining economic machine.
And the results? I mean, they were staggering. At its peak, we're talking nearly 2 million people calling this booming metropolis home. 2 million. This number right here, it represents the absolute peak of American industrial might. This was a city that was the envy of the entire world.
But here's the thing, there wasn't one single event that marked the end. There was no final fatal blow. Instead, the city's collapse was this slow, creeping process. It was like a fatal illness where the circulation just slowly fails, one limb at a time.
And this is exactly how it happened. It was a domino effect, a cascade of seemingly small events. First, a factory automates a production line, right? Lays off a few hundred workers. Then some of those families decide to leave for the suburbs. Pretty soon, a whole street starts to empty out. The city loses that tax revenue, so maybe a fire station closes. A library shuts down with the excuse that, fewer people are using it anyway. Each little step just weakens the city's core. And the crazy part is, every single one of these steps was rationalized away with this cold corporate language. Just optimizing costs, just reallocating resources. Nobody ever stood up and said, okay, we are now beginning the process of dismantling the city. No, instead, it was all just business as usual. And that language totally obscured the terrifying bigger picture that was forming over decades.
So you see, these weren't just isolated incidents. They were all symptoms of the city's circulation failing. It's just like when blood stops flowing to a limb, the tissue begins to die. And in Detroit, entire neighborhoods became these dead zones. Well, this whole process eventually led to an official time of death being called. But the autopsy that came after, it raised a lot more questions than it answered. So in 2013, Detroit officially declared bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. But for most Americans, the reaction was kind of a shrug. It felt inevitable. And that's because the death certificate was really just a formality. The real death had happened long, long before. The bankruptcy filing, that answers what happened. But the real investigation, the real autopsy, is about the why and the when. And, I think most importantly, it's about this third question. Is this disease contagious? Could the things that killed Detroit be present in other cities?
And part of the reason nobody was really surprised by the bankruptcy is that, Detroit had already died in our collective imagination. In Hollywood movies, in news reports, it had become this cultural shorthand for urban decay. It was the go-to post-apocalyptic backdrop for stories about failure.
This perception was seriously fueled by a phenomenon that people started calling ruin porn. You've probably seen it. These photos of grand, decaying theaters and abandoned schools started to be treated like art. But what that did was it aestheticized the city's collapse. It turned a real human tragedy into a spectacle instead of a warning that we should have been examining.
Okay, so now we're getting to the most vital part of this whole story. Because Detroit is not just some isolated accident. It's a cautionary tale. It's a blueprint for failure that was written across decades, and it's one we really need to understand.
So here they are,
These are the underlying conditions, the pre-existing vulnerabilities that made Detroit so susceptible to collapse. An economy completely dependent on a single industry. A blind faith that the good times would just last forever. Deep-seated social and racial issues that were just never resolved. And, maybe the most dangerous one of all, that stubborn belief that it can't happen here. That a city so great could never truly fall.
And this right here, this is the tragic paradox of Detroit's story. The very things that made it strong, its singular focus, its industrial might, its unwavering confidence, were the exact same things that tore it apart from the inside. They made the whole structure brittle, so when the world changed, it didn't bend, it just shattered.
So what does this autopsy really reveal? Well, this isn't just a history lesson. Because today, that body, strangely, is beginning to stir once more. Parts of Detroit are reviving. But understanding how it died is absolutely critical to knowing if this new life is actually sustainable.
And that leaves us with this final, kind of haunting question. As we watch parts of Detroit come back to life, have we actually learned anything from its past? Or is its history just a map, a preview of a future that other cities that are just as confident in their own success right now, might still have to face?
You know, when you look at Detroit today, you see two completely different stories. You see this incredible rebirth, but you also see this deep, lingering abandonment. To really get why that is, you have to go back and understand the powerful idea that built the city in the first place. And trust me, it was never just about cars. It was something much bigger, almost like a new kind of religion.
So let's go back to the early 20th century. Detroit wasn't just coming up with a new way to build stuff. No, it was forging an entire way of life, a whole philosophy, a kind of secular religion that was born right there on the factory floor.
And this was the Big Bang, the core of it all, Henry Ford's moving assembly line. Now, think about how things were made before this. You had a craftsman, one person, who might build a whole product from start to finish. But in 1913, Ford flipped that script completely. The product moved, and each worker just did one tiny, repetitive thing over and over. It was a massive shift in thinking, from skilled craftsmanship to pure industrial efficiency. And the results of this change? I mean, they were absolutely mind-blowing. The time it took to build a single car, a Model T, went from over 12 hours down to about 90 minutes. Just let that sink in. This wasn't just a small improvement. It was a total game changer. It sent costs plummeting, prices dropped, and all of a sudden, a car wasn't just a toy for rich people anymore. It was something a regular working family could actually dream about owning. But here's the thing. How do you convince people to do that same monotonous job hour after hour, day after day? Well, Ford came up with a brilliant historic answer. He offered them $5 a day. Back in 1914, that was a staggering amount of money. But it was way more than just a good paycheck. It was a deal. It was a social contract that said, give us your discipline and your repetitive labor, and in return, we will give you a stable middle-class life. And right there, that's how this new religion really started to form. The factory, the line, that steady paycheck, it all came together to create this powerful belief system. It was a deep faith in productivity, a complete trust in the idea of stable work, and this absolute conviction that if you just worked hard, your future was going to be better. Now, the crazy part is that this industrial religion, it didn't just stay behind the factory gates. Not at all. It spilled out into the streets, into the neighborhoods, and it built a very real, tangible lifestyle that for decades would define the American dream. And this was the promise, the deal that pulled in hundreds of thousands of people. You don't need a college degree. You could get a job, a good one, that paid enough to raise a family. You could buy a house with a garage and put a car that you probably helped build, right in the driveway. This promise was a powerful magnet, especially for Black Americans who were fleeing the Jim Crow South, desperately looking for a real opportunity. This quote, man, it just gets right to the heart of the whole thing. The work was tough, it was grueling, no doubt about it, but it wasn't just for you, for right now. It was an investment. The whole point was that your kids could have a life you couldn't, that they could go to college and climb even higher up the ladder. So what you have is this incredible machine, a machine that was printing more than just cars. It was printing a national belief. During World War II, this machine became the arsenal of democracy, building tanks and planes. In peacetime, it was building the proof, The cars, the jobs, the houses. That the American way, that industrial capitalism, was the best system in the world. But you knew there was a but coming, right? Here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Because when a system is so successful for so long, a really dangerous kind of blindness can creep in. And the very thing that made Detroit so strong ended up becoming its greatest weakness. And that brings us to the key question, really. When something works too well for too long, what happens? We stop questioning it. We start to think that this temporary setup is a permanent law of the universe. And that is exactly what happened in Detroit. I mean, the money was flowing, the city was booming, so nobody, not in the boardrooms, not in City Hall, had any reason to ask these simple but terrifying questions. Everyone was focused on the next quarter's profits. Meanwhile, overseas, other countries were building different kinds of cars, smaller and more efficient. But for a city that had bet everything on one single industry, the idea that the whole foundation could crack was, well, it was unthinkable. All that success also acted like a fresh coat of paint, you know? It covered up these really deep cracks in the city's foundation. Huge issues like housing segregation and racial inequality were just simmering right under the surface. But since the machine seemed to be working, everyone just sort of agreed to kick that can down the road, to treat it like a problem for another day. So let's fast forward. That future that they kept putting off, well, eventually it arrived. And the fallout from all that unquestioned belief, both economic and social, created the divided city that we see today. It's almost a cliche, but it's true. Detroit today is a tale of two cities. You have this downtown core that's bursting with new life. It's full of new investment, tech companies, new construction, young people. But then you just drive a little bit out into the outer neighborhoods and you see where the longtime residents are living with the ghosts of that old system, with fewer services, with vacant lots, and with the memory of a promise that just ran out. In the end, Detroit's story is incredible. It shows us that rebirth is absolutely possible. But it also leaves us with this really tough, really important question. When a city is reborn, who gets to be a part of that new life? You know, when we talk about Detroit, it's easy to just list off dates and events. But today, we're doing something different. We're not just looking at history, we're conducting an autopsy. We're going to go deep, really deep, to figure out how this icon of the American dream didn't just fall, it collapsed from the inside out. All right, so first things first, let's fire up the time machine and head back. I want you to picture Detroit in the 1950s. This is the city at its absolute peak. It wasn't just a city, it was the city, the engine of America. A genuine industrial powerhouse that felt, well, completely unstoppable. And to everyone else looking in, Detroit was the American dream, period. It was proof that it could be done. The city was overflowing with prosperity and power. And it had this vibe, this aura of total invincibility. It was humming with this incredible confidence, like, yeah, we're building the future right here. Okay, so that's the golden age. Now let's talk about the fall. We're gonna look at the official story first. You know, the diagnosis we've all heard a million times about what went wrong. And the story usually goes something like this, right? A bunch of big external shocks just slammed into the city, one right after another. You had civil unrest and white flight, then the oil crisis in the 70s, then intense competition from Japan in the 80s, all leading up to that massive bankruptcy in 2013. These are the usual suspects, the easy-to-blame culprits. But, and this is the big but, what if those were just the symptoms? What if the real disease was already in the system, lurking beneath the surface? That's what we're going to dig into. We're going to re-examine this whole story, because what if those big shocks didn't actually kill Detroit? What if they just revealed a fatal illness that had been festering for decades, baked right into the city's DNA? And this right here is the heart of our investigation. We've pinpointed what we're calling 3 internal pathogens, 3 core problems that made the city incredibly vulnerable long before the first big crisis even showed up on the horizon. So pathogen number 1, Detroit was, for all intents and purposes, a one-legged city. It's not that it was just strong in the auto industry, it was that the auto industry was the only thing. I mean, everything. Corporate taxes, income taxes, the little diner on the corner, the local schools, you name it. It was all tied to the health of car manufacturing. One single economic engine for the entire city. And this quote just nails the problem perfectly. Think about it. A body with super strong legs, but a weak heart and lungs. When everything's going great, that structure seems amazing. It looks so powerful and efficient. But any system, and I mean any system, that's built on a single pillar is fragile, by definition, no matter how strong that pillar seems. It looked perfectly healthy, right up until the moment it suddenly wasn't.
Now, this total reliance on one industry created the perfect breeding ground for our second pathogen, which we're calling captured power. See, over time, the three most powerful groups in town, we're talking the big auto corporations, the massive labor unions, and the local government, they all realized they had a shared interest in keeping things exactly the way they were.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Take a look at this triangle of inertia. Normally, you'd expect these groups to be in a push and pull, balancing each other out. But in Detroit, they became locked together. Their individual goals all merged into one single overriding mission: maintain the status quo, protect the old model no matter what. So just imagine for a second, someone comes along with a great idea to bring in, say, a brand new tech industry. For these three players, that's not an exciting opportunity. No way. It's a threat to their control over jobs, votes, and the flow of money. So any serious talk about diversification or real change, it was pretty much dead on arrival. And that leads us directly to pathogen number 3, living on inertia. As the auto industry started losing ground and the city's revenue began to drop, you'd think they'd tighten their belts, right? Nope. Detroit's spending habits didn't change one bit. The city just kept on spending like it was the golden age, like it was still 1955. And this chart really tells the story. The key thing to see here is that widening gap. Revenue is going down, but spending is staying stubbornly high. So how did they cover the difference? They borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed some more. It's the classic story of someone who loses a 6-figure job but keeps the mansion and the sports car by just maxing out credit card after credit card, basically just praying that things would magically turn around. So when you understand these deep internal problems, it's not just about explaining the past. It's about understanding why Detroit's recovery today is so complex and, frankly, so uneven. Because that underlying fragility, it created the two Detroits that exist right now. In one Detroit, you have this gleaming, revitalized downtown core. You've got new towers shooting up, cool startups everywhere, young professionals moving in. It looks amazing. But then there's the other Detroit. You go just a few miles out, and you're in the vast outer rings of the city, which are still dealing with the fallout. Abandoned homes, empty lots, a future that feels weighed down by the past. It's the legacy of a system that, when you look at it this way, was almost designed to fail. And all of this leaves us with one huge, lingering question for the future. Has Detroit actually healed those internal wounds? Has it built a truly new, more resilient system? Or is the incredible revival we're seeing today just a shiny new coat of paint on the same old fragile body?
Detroit, the Motor City. Its collapse is a story we all think we know. You know, a story of rust, decay, and finally bankruptcy. But what if that story, the one we've all heard, is just the surface wound? What if the real cause of death was something way deeper, a kind of pathogen that was there from the very beginning? In this explainer, we're going to perform an autopsy on a system that, as you'll see, was basically built to fail.
So here's the timeline you'd find in pretty much any textbook. It's a neat, convenient story, right? You've got the riots back in '67, the oil crisis in '73, then all that competition from Japan in the '80s, and boom, bankruptcy in 2013. Each event is like another body blow, another fatal shock from the outside that brought a great city to its knees. And, on the surface, it makes a certain kind of sense.
But here's the question we really need to ask. Were those shocks the actual cause of death? Or were they just the final storm that exposed a sickness that had been growing inside Detroit for decades? To really get what happened, we can't just look at the moment of impact. We have to look at the body itself. So, let's do it. Let's start that medical autopsy right now. We're going to peel back the layers to find 3 critical, pre-existing conditions that pretty much made Detroit's collapse inevitable, long before those crisis headlines ever started appearing.
Okay, let's start with symptom number 1. We're calling it the one-legged body. And this gets right to the DNA of Detroit's economy, this extreme, almost total reliance on just one industry. And I mean, look, the situation was it was wild. Detroit wasn't just strong in the auto industry, it basically was the auto industry. A staggering 85% of the city's entire economy was tied one way or another to making cars. Think about that.
corporate taxes, your income taxes, property values, the corner store, the local school. Literally everything was bolted to the health of this one single thing. And here's the real kicker. During the good times, this looked like a stroke of genius. It was super efficient. City planning was simple. Workforce training was straightforward. The mantra was easy. Keep the auto industry happy and Detroit will be happy. But in systems thinking, any structure that relies on a single pillar, no matter how massive that pillar seems, is incredibly fragile.
The source material has this fantastic metaphor for it. It says Detroit became like a body that poured all its energy into its legs, becoming this world-class sprinter. But in the process, it totally neglected its vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the brain. It looked unbelievably powerful, right up until the moment it stumbled. And when it did, there was nothing else there to hold it up.
So, that single-minded focus, it leads us directly into our second symptom, locked-in power. If the one-legged economy was the body's physical weakness, this was the disease that paralyzed its ability to ever adapt or find a cure. The city's whole power structure had become a cage. Back in the golden years, Detroit's policies were all shaped by this triangle of power. You had the big auto corporations creating all the jobs, the powerful labor unions protecting the workers, and the local politicians trying to balance everyone's interests. And on paper, that sounds like a perfect system of checks and balances, right? But over time, that balance got completely warped. The triangle turned into a closed loop, this self-reinforcing circle where everybody's number one interest was just keeping the old system exactly as it was. The corporations, the unions, the politicians, they all had a massive incentive not to diversify, not to restructure, and definitely not to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the car-focused model had a shelf life. Any real talk of change was seen as a betrayal. And what do you get from that? You get a culture of denial and delay. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? We'll worry about diversifying later. For now, just let the auto industry carry us. And my personal favorite? Don't worry, the market will fix itself. But the market doesn't owe any city a living. It just moves on. Which brings us to the final, fatal symptom. Symptom number 3, living on the past. This is where the economic reality and the political paralysis slammed right into the city's checkbook. Simply put, Detroit was financially unable to accept its new, smaller reality. And here, you can just see this massive disconnect. On one side, you have the cold, hard economic reality. Tax revenues are drying up, market share is shrinking, people are leaving. But on the other side, city spending was still partying like it was 1955. It was propping up a bloated bureaucracy, these incredibly generous pension promises, and long-term union contracts with all sorts of golden clauses that were signed way back in the boom years. The source offers this incredibly relatable analogy. The city acted just like someone who lost a high-paying job but refused to change their lifestyle. Instead of cutting back, they just kept swiping the credit card, borrowing from the future, all to keep up the illusion that everything was fine. So rather than making the really painful political choices needed to adapt, the city just chose debt. It kicked the can down the road by borrowing more and more money. But that's only a short-term fix for a deep structural problem. No city and no person can borrow forever. Eventually, that bill always comes due. And that brings us to our final autopsy report. This slide really puts it all together. The apparent causes of death, the external shocks, the mismanagement, the bankruptcy, they were real, but they weren't the true cause. The real pre-existing conditions were a fragile, one-legged economy, a locked-in power structure that hated change, and a financial system that was living in the past. The shocks didn't kill Detroit, they just revealed it was already dying. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that Detroit didn't collapse because it was unlucky. It collapsed because the very system that made it so successful in the 20th century was fundamentally completely wrong for the world that came next. Its greatest strength had become its fatal flaw. And that leaves us with one last unavoidable question. As Detroit works to rebuild itself on a totally new foundation, its story is like a powerful warning for all of us. It forces you to look in the mirror and ask, how many of our own systems today, in our cities and the companies we work for, maybe even our own careers, are also built on a single fragile leg? Looking powerful for now? Sure, but maybe just waiting for one unexpected shock to show how vulnerable they really are. Detroit. Just saying the name brings up these powerful images, right? Industrial might, urban collapse. And now? Well, now it's something else entirely. We're going to go way beyond the simple story of a city that died. We're diving into the really complex, fascinating story of a giant that looks like it's finally waking up. And honestly, this quote just nails it. See, Detroit today isn't one thing. It's not just a comeback story, and it's not just a story of collapse. It's both at the same time. It's a city of incredible contrasts, caught right between its haunting past and a future that's, well, really uncertain, but could be absolutely brilliant. So let's try and unpack that paradox.
All right, so let's start with the good news, the comeback side of the coin. What are the actual, tangible signs of life? We're talking hard evidence that suggests something is genuinely changing in the Motor City. Okay, I know what you're thinking. That number looks tiny. It looks like a rounding error, right? But for Detroit, this is monumental. After literally plummeting from a peak of 1.8 million people all the way down to just over 600,000, for the first time in nearly 70 years, the city's population has stopped shrinking. That massive decades-long exodus, it's over. Detroit isn't just a place people leave anymore. It's becoming a place people choose.
So who exactly is making that choice? Well, it's not the old guard coming back. It's a totally new wave of people. You've got young professionals, tech workers, artists, entrepreneurs, basically folks who are just fed up with the insane cost of living in places like New York or San Francisco. They look at Detroit and they don't see a ruin, they see a blank canvas, a place with affordable homes and huge empty warehouses that are just begging to be turned into studios or workshops or the next big startup. It's that freedom, the kind only a once abandoned city can offer, that's pulling them in.
And all this new life, this new blood, is being pumped through the city by some absolutely massive new projects. I love this metaphor on the slide. It's perfect. It's like these huge developments are brand new, vital organs being transplanted into the city's old body, trying to jolt it back to life. Let's look at the three biggest ones.
You can really boil it down to three main pillars. First up, you have Hudson's Detroit. This is a massive new skyscraper going up on a legendary spot. It represents a whole new kind of wealth for the city, not from assembly lines, but from finance, hotels, and high-end services. Then there's the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a brand new artery connecting the city to Canada, plugging Detroit right back into the flow of North American trade. And finally, you have the most symbolic project of them all, Michigan Central.
And this is what's so incredible, and what really gets to the heart of Detroit's new strategy. For decades, Michigan Central Station was the ultimate symbol of urban decay. I mean, it was this gorgeous, hollowed-out ruin that Hollywood used as a set for post-apocalyptic movies. But now, Ford has completely transformed it into a high-tech hub for electric vehicles and innovation. They didn't tear down the history, they grabbed it and forced it to become the foundation for the future.
And it's not just the physical city that's changing, it's the whole vibe, the atmosphere. When Detroit hosted the 2024 NFL Draft, it was way more than just a football event. It was basically a national rebranding campaign. For one weekend, millions of people watching at home saw a city that was alive, safe, and absolutely packed with energy, a world away from that old, tired stereotype.
So, what does all this add up to? You get this really unique vibe. It's not polished, it's not perfect. People compare it to a grittier, edgier Brooklyn, or maybe Berlin back in its early creative days. It's this place where you can literally see decay and ambition sitting side by side. It's gritty, but there's money flowing in. It's dilapidated, but it is buzzing with new ideas. But after seeing all this investment, all this new energy, we have to hit the pause button. We have to look past the gleaming new towers and ask a much tougher, much more complicated question.
Exactly. Who is this revival really for? Is it for the people who've lived there their whole lives, the working-class folks who stuck it out through the absolute darkest days? Or is it for the new arrivals, the tech workers and the artists who are now snapping up property? Because when you zoom out from that sparkling downtown core, a very, very different picture of Detroit starts to emerge.
The reality for so many of the city's outer neighborhoods is a world away from the downtown boom. We're talking about places where you still find entire blocks of abandoned homes, where grass is growing chest-high in empty lots, places with a serious lack of basic public services, reliable buses, good schools, hospitals. It feels less like a citywide revival and more like a very targeted operation. The new organs are thriving, sure, but the limbs of the body are still withering away.
And this chart just lays it out in black and white. You basically have two different Detroits operating at the same time. You've got the downtown core, which is flooded with billions in new money, getting better services, and sprouting new businesses. And then you have this outer ring that feels, for the most part, forgotten. So the central question becomes, can this thriving core actually pull the rest of the city up with it, or is it just going to become a wealthy island in a sea of neglect? So where does that leave us?
What's the final prognosis for this giant that's stirring from its slumber? Well, the honest truth is, Detroit is still stuck right there in the middle, suspended between those two poles of collapse and comeback. Because when you really look closely at this boom, you start to see that it's built on some familiar and maybe even fragile foundations. There's a heavy reliance on real estate speculation, on big tax incentives, all banking on the hope that property values just keep going up. But what happens when the next big economic shock hits? Is this new Detroit actually resilient enough to handle it?
And that really is the crucial point, isn't it? Has the city truly learned from its own catastrophic collapse? Is it building a genuinely diverse, flexible economy that can handle whatever the future throws at it? A recession, a tech bubble bursting, you name it. Or is it just repeating the same old cycle of boom and bust all over again?
And that leaves us with this final, kind of haunting question. Is what we're all watching a true resurrection? A revival of body and soul for an entire city? Or is Detroit just putting a new, really expensive suit on the same old skeleton? The truth is, nobody knows the answer yet. And that uncertainty, that tension, that's what makes Detroit one of the most important and compelling stories to watch in the world today. But we're going to look at it through a totally different lens. Not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint. Maybe even a prototype for the future of cities in the 21st century. Wow. I mean, that's a chilling thought, isn't it? The idea that a massive, living, breathing city can just fade away while the rest of the world isn't even paying attention. This one quote, it just perfectly sets the stage for Detroit's incredible journey. From the very top of the industrial world to the absolute brink of collapse, and now to something else entirely. So to really get what Detroit is now, we have to rewind the clock. We have to start with the myth, with the legend of 1950s Detroit, when the city was at the absolute peak of its power. This was the era of the steel dream. Just try to imagine it for a second. Mid-century Detroit was the engine of America. It was this gleaming metropolis of steel, of glass, and most importantly, of this unshakable belief in progress. This place wasn't just a city, it was a symbol of what felt like endless American prosperity, a place where the future was being built every single day. And that was the feeling in the air, you know? People would look at the new skyscrapers shooting up, at the endless lines of cars rolling off the factory floors, and they all shared this one simple, powerful thought. There was this boundless optimism that things would just keep getting better and better forever.
But, well, we all know what happened next. That upward curve, it didn't just bend, it broke. And that brings us to the second act in this story, the city's dramatic, painful decline. A fall that was, in its own way, just as spectacular as its rise.
The contrast is just staggering. The city of steel and glass became a city of decay. By the time we get to the 2010s, the images everyone saw of Detroit were of urban ruin, entire neighborhoods defined by nothing but broken bricks and boarded-up windows. This shift says it all, right? The city that once embodied America's greatest hopes became the symbol of its worst fears. That boundless optimism just curdled into a cautionary tale, a future that nobody wanted anything to do with. But the story doesn't end in ruin. Nope. In fact, this is where it gets really fascinating, because that total collapse, it sets the stage for our main idea here, Detroit as a prototype, a model for what comes after the break.
If you go to Detroit today, you see something pretty strange, but also really compelling. You'll see these shiny new glass towers, and in their reflection, you can see the empty shells of old houses. The train station that used to be a set for apocalypse movies is now lit up like a computer circuit board. It's a place where the past and the future aren't just coexisting. They're in a constant, visible conversation with each other.
And this is exactly why we're calling Detroit a prototype city. It's basically a living laboratory. It's a case study for how a complex urban system can build itself up, suffer a catastrophic failure, and then begin the messy process of remaking itself from the ground up.
And this whole cycle seems to follow a predictable pattern, almost like a formula. First, a city booms because of one single giant industry. Then, that pillar industry gets hit with a major shock. After that, the tax base collapses and society itself starts to fracture. The city then enters this kind of vacuum state. But then comes the final step. A new generation shows up and sees all that emptiness not as a void, but as a blank canvas.
Now, it's really tempting to think this is just a Detroit story, but it's not. The only real difference is that Detroit's collapse happened earlier, it went deeper, and it was just way more visible than what's happening elsewhere. You could say it experienced the entire 21st century urban cycle before anyone else.
And just look around us. We're seeing the early stages of this exact pattern playing out everywhere. Tech hubs are dealing with massive layoffs and empty office buildings, finance hubs are incredibly vulnerable to global money shifts, and cities built on tourism or oil, well, they're always just one pandemic or one climate disaster away from a major crisis. This means the lessons from Detroit's journey aren't just history. They might just be a roadmap for cities everywhere.
So this brings us to our final act. What does this new Detroit, a city literally forged in collapse, really represent? What does it actually mean to build a future on a foundation of ruins?
This is the question everybody asks, right? Can it return to its former glory? Can the Motor City reclaim its throne as the shiny, confident heart of American industry? It's a natural thing to ask, but it might be the wrong question.
Maybe this is the more powerful, more relevant question. Because let's be honest, the past is gone. The very model that made Detroit so huge is the same one that led to its collapse. So going back to that can't be the goal. The real question is what a city becomes after it has been through both incredible success and total failure.
And the possible answers are fascinating. Maybe Detroit becomes this cool hybrid city, mixing its old industrial muscle with new creative energy. Maybe it becomes this rugged, resilient hub for logistics and tech and culture. Or maybe, and this could be the most important thing, it just becomes a place that truly understands a fundamental truth. No structure, no matter how powerful, lasts forever.
The people who are rebuilding the city now, they aren't driven by some fuzzy nostalgia for the 1950s. They're not chasing a myth. They are drawn to the city precisely because it collapsed, because those ruins created space, both physically and mentally, to try something completely new. And maybe this is the truest picture of what a successful city in the 21st century is going to look like. Not some perfect, gleaming place that's never known failure, but something tougher, something more resilient. A city that doesn't try to hide its history, but instead dares to carry its scars forward as a mark of survival and as a license to reinvent itself again and again.